15 Facts about Comanche, fiercest Native American tribe. Did you know there are 15 surprising facts about the Comanche that will change how you see history? Their rise to power and unique way of life will shock you. Subscribe to Hey Chinese 9 Studio for the full story. Humble beginnings. Life before the horse. Before their emergence as the dominant power of the southern plains, the Comanche lived a considerably more modest existence. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, they were primarily hunter-gatherers dwelling in the Rocky Mountain regions, part of the larger Shoshone linguistic family. Comanche women, the economic and social foundation. These travois, frame structures made of wooden poles covered with animal hides, were pulled by domesticated dogs, the only beasts of burden available to them. A typical Comanche family might have owned several dogs, each capable of hauling between 30–50 pounds of material possessions. While this system allowed for necessary movement, it severely limited both speed and carrying capacity. The constraints of dog transportation meant Comanche bands traveled slowly, perhaps covering only 5–8 miles per day during migrations, and could transport only essential items. This reliance on canine transportation was not unique to the Comanche, but was common among many plains and mountain indigenous groups. Yet for the Comanche, this modest beginning would serve as a stark contrast to what they would become. The Great Transformation, acquisition of the horse. The watershed moment in Comanche history occurred in the late 17th century, around 1680–1690, coinciding with the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 against Spanish colonizers in present-day New Mexico. During this uprising, thousands of horses fell into indigenous hands, quickly spreading through native trade networks. The Comanche, positioned advantageously within these networks, were among the early adopters of this revolutionary technology. The transition from dog to horse was not merely a change in transportation. It represented a complete reimagining of Comanche society. With horses, a Comanche band could now travel 20–30 miles per day, quadrupling their previous range. Hunting efficiency increased dramatically. Mounted hunters could now pursue bison herds with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. A horse could carry up to 200 pounds of goods, 4 times what a dog could manage, allowing families to transport more possessions, accumulate more wealth, and develop more complex material cultures. Perhaps most significantly, the Comanche demonstrated extraordinary aptitude for horsemanship. Children, as young as 5 years old, began riding, and by adolescence, young Comanche riders could execute maneuvers that astounded European observers. They developed techniques for shooting arrows accurately, while at full gallop, including the remarkable feat of firing under the neck of their mount while using the horse's body as a shield. Their saddles, designed for maximum mobility, allowed riders to drop to the side of the horse while remaining secured by a single foot, presenting a minimal target to enemies. Historical accounts from Spanish, French, Mexican, and American sources consistently describe Comanche riding skills in superlative terms. One Spanish officer in the 1770s wrote that Comanche warriors are so skilled on horseback that they have no equal in the world. Frontiersman and trader Josiah Gregg similarly observed in the 1830s that a Comanche is nothing off his horse, but once mounted, he is everything. Masters of adaptation, seasonal migration, and environmental knowledge. The Comanche's adaptive intelligence extended beyond horsemanship to a sophisticated understanding of their environment. They developed a finely tuned annual migration cycle that maximized access to resources while minimizing exposure to harsh weather conditions. During spring and summer months, roughly April through September, Comanche bands dispersed widely across the southern plains, following bison herds and harvesting seasonal plants. These months saw intensive hunting, with fresh meat consumed immediately and surplus processed into pemmican and jerky for winter stores. Hides were collected for tippies, clothing, and trade. As autumn approached, bands began gravitating toward river valleys and more sheltered areas. The winter months, November through March, were spent in protected locations, such as the Palo Duro Canyon, the upper reaches of the Colorado River, or the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. These winter camps, selected for access to water, wood, and wind protection, might host several bands together, creating larger communities of 200–300 people during the coldest months. The Comanche demonstrated remarkable environmental knowledge, identifying microclimates within their territory that offered the best conditions for each season. They tracked weather patterns with precision, reading cloud formations, wind directions, and animal behaviors to anticipate changes. Their mobile lifestyle allowed them to respond quickly to environmental shifts, moving to higher elevations during summer heat, or seeking shelter before major storms. This seasonal migration pattern, perfected over generations, represented a sophisticated adaptation to the challenging environment of the southern plains. The introduction of horses made this lifestyle not merely viable but extraordinarily successful, allowing the Comanche to thrive in a landscape that European settlers would later find incredibly challenging. The rise to power, lords of the southern plains. The Comanche's mastery of horsemanship translated directly into unprecedented military prowess and territorial control. By the early 18th century, they had emerged as the dominant force across the southern Great Plains, earning them the formidable title Lords of the Southern Plains. This was no mere honorific. It was a recognition of their unmatched ability to project power across an immense geographical area. Their dominance stemmed from several key advantages. First, their mounted warfare tactics were revolutionary. Comanche warriors could strike with devastating speed and then disappear before enemies could organize a response. They developed techniques for fighting on horseback that European military observers found remarkable, including the ability to shoot accurately while riding at full gallop and to use their horses as mobile platforms for launching attacks. Second, the Comanche established control over crucial trade routes that connected Spanish settlements in New Mexico, French interests along the Mississippi, and indigenous communities throughout the region. At its height in the mid-18th century, Comancheria functioned as the power center of the southern plains. The Spanish in New Mexico, despite their firearms and fortifications, found themselves largely contained by Comanche raids and were forced into diplomatic accommodations. The scale of Comanche military effectiveness is evident in historical records. During the 1760s, 1780s, their raids into northern Mexico were so devastating that some settlements were abandoned entirely. Spanish military expeditions sent against them frequently ended in failure. By 1786, Spanish authorities in New Mexico had shifted to a policy of accommodation rather than confrontation, a rare instance of a European colonial power being forced to treat with indigenous people on equal or disadvantageous terms. The Comanche sphere of influence, at its peak, encompassed approximately 250,000 square miles, larger than France. Within this territory, they extracted tribute from smaller tribes, controlled access to hunting grounds and water sources, and regulated trade. Their power was such that major expeditions, whether Spanish, French, Mexican, or later American, needed either Comanche permission or sufficient military strength to traverse their territory safely. The buffalo economy, beyond mere subsistence. The relationship between the Comanche and the bison buffalo represented far more than a simple predator-prey dynamic. It was the cornerstone of an entire economic and cultural system. The bison provided the material foundation upon which Comanche society was built, influencing everything from settlement patterns to spiritual practices. A single bison could yield up to 800 pounds of meat, providing sustenance for a Comanche family for weeks. But the animal's utility extended far beyond food. The hide, when tanned, became the primary material for teepees, with an average dwelling requiring 8–12 skins. These portable homes were perfectly suited to Comanche mobility, being weather-resistant, insulated, and capable of being dismantled and reassembled within an hour by experienced hands. Bison hides also provided material for clothing, including moccasins, leggings, and winter robes. When properly prepared with the hair still attached, these robes offered protection against the harshest winter conditions the plains could produce. The sinew-strong, fibrous tissue connecting muscle to bone was extracted and processed into thread that was stronger than any plant fiber available. Used for sewing clothing, constructing bows, and attaching stone points to arrows. The Comanche waist, not want, not approach, utilized virtually every part of the bison. Horns became ladles and cups. Hooves were rendered for glue. Stomach and bladder membranes served as water containers. Ribs were fashioned into sledges for children. Dried dung buffalo chips provided fuel in the timber, scarce plains environment. Beyond material provisions, the bison shaped Comanche military tactics, economic exchange systems, and even concepts of wealth. A successful hunt yielding dozens of bison represented not just immediate resources, but potential trade goods. By the late 18th century, the Comanche had established thriving commerce in bison products, exchanging hides, dried meat, and tallow for manufactured goods, weapons, and horses from both European traders and other indigenous groups. The synchronized seasonal migrations of both bison and Comanche people created a rhythm to life that merged economic necessity with cultural identity. Major communal hunts were social events as much as economic activities, bringing together extended family groups and strengthening social bonds through cooperative work and celebration. When the great bison herds were decimated in the late 19th century, reduced from an estimated 30 million animals to mere hundreds by the 1880s, the ecological foundation of Comanche society collapsed. This loss, more than any military defeat, undermined their independence and power, demonstrating how thoroughly the fate of the Comanche had become intertwined with that of the bison. Spiritual connections. The shamanic worldview. The Comanche spiritual worldview was characterized by a profound interconnection between the material and spiritual realms, mediated through shamanic practices that remain partially mysterious to outside observers due to the private nature of many ceremonies and the disruption of traditional knowledge transmission during the reservation period. Central to Comanche spirituality was the concept of puha supernatural power that permeated the universe and could be accessed by humans through proper ritual means. This power was believed to be especially concentrated in certain animals, natural phenomena, and places. Bears, eagles, bison, and wolves were considered particularly powerful spiritual entities. Thunderstorms, whirlwinds, and unusual geographical features, like distinctive rock formations or springs, were also seen as sources of power. Shamans called puhakat in the Comanche language served as intermediaries between the community and these spiritual forces. Unlike some tribal structures with hereditary religious leadership, Comanche shamanic status was achieved through individual spiritual experiences, particularly dreams and visions. A potential shaman might seek visions through solitary fasting and prayer in remote locations, sometimes using tobacco or other plant substances to facilitate the spiritual experience. Once recognized, shamans fulfilled multiple social roles. They conducted healing ceremonies using herbal knowledge combined with spiritual practices. They performed rituals before major hunts or military expeditions. They interpreted dreams and omens, guiding their community in decisions. Some specialized in specific domains: war medicine, hunting medicine, or healing particular ailments. Comanche spiritual practices were pragmatic rather than dogmatic. If a particular ritual or medicine proved ineffective, it might be modified or abandoned. This adaptability extended to incorporating elements from other spiritual traditions when they proved useful. including selective adoption of practices from neighboring tribes and even certain Christian concepts following European contact. Material manifestations of spiritual beliefs included medicine bundles, collections of sacred objects that embodied protective or empowering spiritual forces. Personal medicine bundles were carried by warriors for protection. Larger communal bundles served the entire band's welfare. The Comanche calendar was organized around significant spiritual and seasonal events. Ceremonies marked critical transitions, such as the return of spring, first thunderstorms, the annual bison hunt. These ceremonies reinforced community bonds, while acknowledging dependence on natural forces beyond human control. While many specific details of Comanche shamanic practices were lost during the cultural disruptions of the late 19th century, the worldview they embodied one in which humans existed in a complex relationship with powerful natural and supernatural forces requiring both respect and ritual management provided a spiritual framework that supported their adaptive, mobile lifestyle and military prowess. Warrior culture, the making of Comanche fighting men. The transformation of Comanche boys into warriors represented one of the most rigorous and effective military training systems developed by any indigenous North American society. This process began almost from birth and created fighters whose skills would eventually challenge the military might of multiple European powers. From their earliest years, Comanche boys were immersed in a culture that valued martial prowess above almost all other attributes. By age 5, boys were expected to ride independently and begin developing skills with miniature bows and arrows. Their toys and games almost exclusively emphasized military skills. Mock battles, horse races, and contests of marksmanship were the daily activities that shaped their childhood. Physical conditioning was relentless and began early. Young boys swam in cold streams. They ran long distances. They endured exposure to harsh weather conditions to build endurance and pain tolerance. By adolescence, they participated in supervised group hunts that tested both individual skills and the ability to function as part of a coordinated unit, the same skills needed in warfare. The formal training intensified during adolescence. Young men learned to make and maintain weapons. They practiced riding techniques that allowed them to control their mount with just their legs, leaving hands free for weapons. They developed the ability to shoot accurately from a galloping horse. They were taught to approach enemies from the right side, as most opponents would be right-handed, and thus less effective at defending against attacks from that direction. A crucial aspect of warrior training involved pain endurance. Young men participated in ceremonies that included ritual scarification, sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures. These practices not only demonstrated commitment but developed the ability to function effectively, despite physical discomfort, a critical skill for warriors who might need to travel hundreds of miles or fight while wounded. The path to full warrior status culminated in participation in raids. Initially, a young man would accompany experienced warriors as an observer. Then, he would gradually take more active roles. The first successful combat action, particularly counting coup, touching an enemy in battle, or taking a captive, marked the transition to recognized warrior status. Following such achievements, a young man might receive an adult name reflecting his accomplishments. Success in warfare brought substantial social benefits. Accomplished warriors gained wealth through captured horses and other plunder. They earned the right to wear distinctive regalia, indicating their exploits. They gained preferential treatment in tribal councils. The most successful warriors eventually became war chiefs, leading larger expeditions and gaining substantial influence in band decision-making. The effectiveness of this training system is evident in historical accounts. Spanish, Mexican, and American military reports consistently note the exceptional fighting abilities of Comanche warriors. Their combination of horsemanship, marksmanship, tactical flexibility, and physical endurance made them among the most formidable light cavalry forces of their era. They were capable of traveling 100 miles in a single day and fighting effectively upon arrival, a mobility that conventional military forces struggled to counter until the late 19th century. Captive taking, strategic population engineering. The Comanche practice of taking captives during raids was far more complex than simple warfare. It represented a sophisticated strategy for demographic growth and cultural adaptation that significantly contributed to their power. Historical records indicate that between 1700 and 1850, Comanche raiders captured thousands of individuals from other indigenous groups, Spanish settlements, Mexican communities, and later American frontier outposts. These captives served multiple strategic purposes within Comanche society. Most importantly, they provided a mechanism for population growth in a society that faced significant demographic challenges. Nomadic lifestyles and warfare typically limited natural population increases. The adoption of captives, particularly women and children, allowed Comanche bands to grow their numbers more rapidly than would have been possible through natural increase alone. Anthropological evidence suggests that by the early 19th century, as many as 30–40% of individuals, in some Comanche bands, were adopted captives or their descendants. The process of incorporation was remarkably thorough. Young captives, typically under age 12, were adopted into families who had lost children to disease or warfare. They received new Comanche names, learned the language, and were raised as full tribal members. Within a generation, these former captives became culturally Comanche in almost every respect. Spanish and Mexican observers frequently encountered blue-eyed, light-haired individuals among Comanche groups who had completely adopted Comanche identity, language, and customs. Women captives often became wives or secondary wives to Comanche men, with their status evolving over time. While initially treated as outsiders, those who adapted to Comanche ways could eventually gain considerable autonomy and respect. Their bilingual and bicultural knowledge frequently proved valuable in trading and diplomatic contexts. The children born to these women were considered fully Comanche and faced no social stigma regarding their mixed parentage. Captives also represented valuable economic and diplomatic assets. Adult male captives were less commonly taken, but might be ransomed back to their communities for horses, weapons, or other goods. High-status captives, such as the children of prominent Mexican or American families, became valuable political pawns in negotiations with colonial powers. The Comanche demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of captives' varying values to different parties. They often moved captives significant distances to ransom them where the highest price could be obtained. This captive-taking system helped the Comanche maintain their dominant position by addressing demographic weaknesses, expanding their cultural and linguistic knowledge, providing economic and diplomatic leverage. The practice created a diverse, adaptable society that incorporated useful skills and knowledge from multiple cultural traditions while maintaining a cohesive Comanche identity. The Comanche-Kiowa alliance combined dominance. The strategic alliance between the Comanche and Kiowa peoples emerged in the early 18th century, approximately 1720–1730, and evolved into one of the most durable and effective indigenous coalitions in North American history. This alliance transformed the geopolitical landscape of the Southern Plains and enabled both groups to resist colonial encroachment far longer than they could have independently. Initially, relations between the two peoples were hostile. The Kiowa, originally from the Northern Plains, moved southward in the early 18th century, bringing them into territorial competition with the Comanche. However, both groups recognized that cooperation offered greater advantages than conflict. By approximately 1740, they had established a formal alliance sealed through intermarriage, ceremonial kinship bonds. Mutual defense agreements. The alliance created significant military advantages for both peoples. Together, they could field fighting forces of exceptional size and capability. Historical accounts describe combined war parties, numbering 1,000 or more warriors. These joint operations extended the reach of their raiding activities from deep within Mexico to the northern plains. This created a zone of influence that covered hundreds of thousands of square miles. Spanish, Mexican, and later American military forces found this combined threat nearly impossible to counter effectively using conventional tactics. Beyond military cooperation, the alliance created economic synergies. The Comanche, with their extensive horse herds and bison hunting expertise, complemented the Kiowa's strong trading networks. The Kiowa trade networks extended north to the Mandan Hidatsa villages on the Missouri River and south into Mexico. Together, they controlled access to critical resources and trade routes. This allowed them to serve as powerful middlemen in the increasingly complex commercial networks of the plains. Cultural exchange strengthened the alliance over generations. The two groups developed shared ceremonial practices. They participated in each other's major religious events. They adopted compatible annual migrations, allowing for seasonal gatherings where goods were exchanged, marriage partners were arranged, cultural practices were reinforced. The durability of this alliance was remarkable in a region characterized by shifting alliances and frequent conflict. From its formal establishment around 1740 until the final reservation period in the 1870s, spanning approximately 130 years, the Comanche and Kiowa maintained their cooperative relationship, even as other alliances formed and dissolved. This consistency gave them significant strategic advantages in diplomatic negotiations with colonial powers, military confrontations with rival indigenous groups, masters of diplomacy, playing European powers against each other. The Comanche demonstrated exceptional diplomatic sophistication in their interactions with European and American colonial powers. They skillfully manipulated rivalries to maintain their independence and enhance their regional dominance. Far from being simply reactive to European encroachment, the Comanche employed a proactive diplomatic strategy that shaped colonial policies across the southern plains for over a century. Beginning with Spanish contact in the early 18th century, the Comanche quickly recognized that European powers could be valuable sources of goods, existential threats. Rather than adopting a uniformly hostile or accommodating stance, Comanche leaders developed a nuanced approach that maximized benefits while minimizing vulnerabilities. They strategically alternated between diplomacy and warfare. They negotiated formal peace agreements when advantageous. They maintained the threat of devastating raids to ensure these agreements were respected. The competition between Spanish and French interests in the early to mid-18th century provided the first significant opportunity for Comanche diplomatic leverage. By playing these rivals against each other, Comanche bands secured access to firearms, metal goods, and luxury items from both sources. When Spanish officials restricted trade, the Comanche increased their interactions with French traders operating from Louisiana. This forced Spanish authorities to reconsider their policies to avoid losing influence to their European competitors. A landmark demonstration of Comanche diplomatic skill occurred in 1785-1786, when they negotiated a comprehensive peace treaty with Spanish authorities in New Mexico. This agreement, achieved after decades of warfare, recognized Comanche territorial claims, established regularized trade relations, made them privileged partners of the Spanish colonial government. Importantly, the treaty was negotiated entirely on Comanche terms, forcing Spanish officials to accept protocols determined by Comanche leaders. The collapse of Spanish control and the emergence of an independent Mexico in the 1820s created new diplomatic openings. Comanche leaders adjusted their strategies to exploit Mexican political instability, extracting more favorable trade terms while continuing their territorial expansion. Simultaneously, they began building relationships with American traders moving west from Missouri, ensuring they were not dependent on any single external partner. Perhaps most impressively, by the 1830s and 1840s, Comanche diplomacy had evolved to include sophisticated multi-party negotiations involving the Republic of Texas, Mexico, various indigenous allies, and the United States. They maintained simultaneous diplomatic relationships with these often antagonistic powers, strategically revealing or withholding information to create advantages. For instance, they might inform Mexican officials about Texas military movements while trading peacefully with selected Texas settlements, effectively maximizing benefits from both sides in the Texas-Mexico conflict. The Comanche diplomatic approach was far from centralized. Individual band leaders maintained flexibility to pursue independent foreign policies, creating a complex, adaptable diplomatic system that colonial powers struggled to comprehend or counter. This decentralization made it nearly impossible for European or American negotiators to secure comprehensive agreements binding all Comanche bands, allowing the collective to maintain strategic flexibility while individual bands pursued specific advantages. This diplomatic sophistication extended the period of Comanche dominance by decades beyond what might have been possible through military resistance alone. Even as American military power grew in the mid-19th century, Comanche diplomatic maneuvering delayed their eventual confinement to reservations until the 1870s, long after many other indigenous nations had lost their independence. Comanche women, the economic and social foundation. The critical contributions of Comanche women to their society's success have often been underrepresented in historical accounts, which tend to focus on male warrior activities. However, archaeological evidence, ethnographic records, and oral histories reveal that women's labor and expertise were fundamental to Comanche economic power and cultural resilience. Comanche women controlled the production and processing systems that transformed natural resources into the material goods essential for both survival and trade. Their most economically significant activity was bison hide processing, a complex, labor-intensive craft requiring immense skill and specialized knowledge. After hunters returned with raw hides, women undertook the multi-stage process of transforming them into valuable finished products. This involved scraping, stretching, tanning, and smoking the hides, work that required physical strength, technical expertise, and considerable time investment. A single tanned buffalo hide could require up to 50 hours of skilled labor to process completely. An accomplished Comanche woman might prepare dozens of hides annually, representing thousands of hours of valuable economic production. These processed hides became teepees, clothing, shields, containers, and high-value trade goods that formed the material foundation of Comanche wealth. Women's economic role extended to maintaining portable domestic infrastructure. They were responsible for constructing, maintaining, and transporting the teepee, a sophisticated dwelling perfectly adapted to plains nomadism. A typical Comanche teepee used 12-18 carefully prepared bison hides stretched over a framework of wooden poles, creating a structure that could be comfortably inhabited in all seasons. When bands relocated, women efficiently disassembled, transported, and reconstructed these dwellings, sometimes moving an entire community in a matter of hours. Food processing represented another crucial economic domain controlled by women. They developed specialized techniques for preserving meat through drying and making pemmican, a high-calorie mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that could sustain warriors and hunters on long expeditions. Women also gathered and processed wild plant foods that diversified the Comanche diet, including roots, nuts, fruits, and medicinal herbs. Beyond these production roles, Comanche women exercised significant authority in key social domains. They influenced band migration patterns by assessing resource availability around potential campsites. They managed the distribution of food within extended family networks, ensuring that resources were allocated according to cultural priorities. They also played critical roles in diplomacy, particularly in establishing and maintaining intertribal alliances through marriage connections. The complementary division of labor between men and women created economic efficiency that directly translated into military and political power. By freeing men to specialize in hunting, raiding, and warfare, women's economic production enabled the intensive militarization that made Comanche expansion possible. Simultaneously, women's processing skills transformed raw resources, like bison hides, into high-value trade goods that brought wealth and technology into Comanche society. Statistical evidence underscores women's economic importance. By the early 19th century, Comanche bands were exporting an estimated 10,015 fully processed bison hides annually, products created almost entirely through women's labor. This production generated substantial wealth that purchased horses, firearms, metal tools, and luxury goods that enhanced Comanche military capabilities and social status. Thus, while male warriors executed the raids and battles that extended Comanche territory, it was women's economic productivity that made this expansion sustainable and profitable. The Comanche legacy: resistance, adaptation, and cultural heritage. Frontier resistance, slowing the tide of colonization. The Comanche resistance to European expansion represents one of the most effective indigenous military campaigns against colonization in North American history. For nearly 150 years, from roughly 1730 to 1875, Comanche warriors successfully contested Spanish, Mexican, Texan, and American attempts to settle their territory, significantly altering the timeline and nature of westward expansion. This resistance was most evident in their impact on Spanish colonial aspirations. By the 1770s, Comanche raids had effectively halted Spanish northward expansion from Mexico, creating what historian Pekka Hamalainen calls an empire of the plains that directly challenged European imperial ambitions. Spanish settlements in northern New Mexico and Texas existed in a perpetual state of defensive posture, with some communities paying regular tribute to Comanche bands to avoid devastating raids. The effectiveness of Comanche military resistance derived from several tactical advantages. Their mounted warriors could cover vast distances quickly, allowing them to strike settlements hundreds of miles apart within weeks. This mobility created a persistent state of uncertainty along frontier communities, as settlers could never predict when or where Comanche raiders might appear. Historical records document attacks occurring simultaneously in locations separated by hundreds of miles, demonstrating their operational range and coordination. When Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, they inherited this unresolved frontier conflict. Mexican attempts to establish settlements in Texas and New Mexico faced determined Comanche opposition. The Mexican government implemented various strategies, including military expeditions, peace treaties, and attempts at forced assimilation, all of which proved largely ineffective against Comanche guerrilla tactics. By the 1830s, Mexican authorities had essentially ceded control of vast territories that were nominally part of their nation, but effectively under Comanche dominion. The Republic of Texas, 1836, 1845, experienced even more direct challenges from Comanche power. Despite their revolutionary rhetoric about taming the frontier, Texas authorities found themselves unable to provide basic security for settlements west of the Colorado River. The Texas Rangers, created specifically to counter indigenous raids, achieved only limited tactical victories that did little to diminish overall Comanche control. The famous Council House fight in San Antonio, 1840, and subsequent events demonstrated the complex and often violent nature of Texan-Comanche relations. Even after Texas joined the United States in 1845, bringing the resources of a much larger nation to bear, Comanche resistance continued. U.S. military campaigns in the 1850s achieved only temporary successes. Army posts established throughout Comancheria could protect only limited areas, while mounted Comanche warriors maintained their ability to strike deep into settled territories. The Civil War, 1861–1865, further complicated American efforts, as military resources were diverted eastward, allowing Comanche bands to reclaim territory previously lost. The cumulative effect of this sustained resistance was a significant delay in Euro-American settlement across a vast region encompassing modern Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Kansas. Areas that might otherwise have been settled decades earlier remained under indigenous control well into the 1870s. When settlement finally did occur, it happened along patterns shaped by prior Comanche resistance, with initial communities clustering along defensible locations and transportation corridors. This extended period of successful military opposition to European colonization stands in marked contrast to many other indigenous experiences, where resistance was often overcome within a generation. The Comanche maintained effective military and territorial control for multiple generations, fundamentally altering the historical development of the American Southwest and leaving an indelible mark on frontier history. Quanah Parker, Leadership in Transition. Quanah Parker stands as one of the most significant indigenous leaders in American history, guiding the Comanche through their difficult transition from independent power to reservation life, while establishing a blueprint for indigenous leadership in a rapidly changing world. Born around 1845–1850 to Comanche chief Pettinocona and Cynthia Ann Parker, a white captive who had been fully integrated into Comanche society. Quanah's life embodied the complex cultural interactions of the frontier. His mother had been captured as a child in an 1836 raid on Parker's fort in Texas, subsequently adopting Comanche ways so completely that when she was rescued by Texas Rangers 24 years later, she repeatedly attempted to return to her Comanche family. Quanah rose to prominence as a war leader of the Quahati Band, the most militant and isolated Comanche group during the decisive Red River War of 1874–1875. After witnessing the systematic destruction of the southern buffalo herds and facing overwhelming U.S. military force, Quanah made the pragmatic decision to surrender in June 1875, becoming the last significant Comanche leader to bring his band onto the reservation in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. What distinguished Quanah from many other indigenous leaders was his remarkable ability to maintain cultural integrity while strategically adopting elements of Euro-American society that could benefit his people. Unlike those who advocated either complete resistance or total assimilation, Quanah charted a middle path, focused on practical survival and cultural preservation. As principal chief of the Comanche on the reservation, a position created by the U.S. government rather than traditional Comanche political structures, Quanah negotiated advantageous agreements for land use. In 1901, he secured for each Comanche family a 160-acre allotment of prime agricultural land, while convincing the tribe to lease additional lands to white ranchers, creating a sustainable income stream. The wealth generated from these arrangements allowed the Comanche to maintain greater independence than many other tribes relegated to reservations. Quanah's political approach was characterized by strategic engagement with American power structures. He cultivated relationships with influential Americans, including ranchers Charles Goodnight and Burke Burnett, and even former enemies like cavalry officer Ranald Mackenzie. These connections allowed him to advocate effectively for Comanche interests in Washington, D.C., where he met with Presidents Grant, McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt. While adapting outwardly to new realities, Quanah maintained cultural continuity in crucial ways. He refused to abandon polygamy, despite pressure from government agents and missionaries, keeping his multiple wives in defiance of assimilationist policies. He became a prominent leader in the Native American Church, which incorporated the ceremonial use of peyote with Christian elements, creating a spiritual practice that helped preserve indigenous identity within a nominally Christian framework. Quanah's large home, built in 1890 near Cache, Oklahoma, known as the Star House, for the stars painted on its roof, symbolized his distinctive leadership approach. It combined European architectural elements with Comanche spatial arrangements and decorative features, serving as both a functional headquarters for tribal business and a symbolic statement about cultural adaptation without surrender. By the time of his death in 1911, Quanah had secured for the Comanche a degree of economic stability, political influence, and cultural continuity that exceeded what many contemporaries achieved. His leadership philosophy, pragmatic engagement with the dominant society, while maintaining core cultural values, created a foundation upon which the Comanche could survive as a distinct people despite the devastating transitions of the late 19th century. The multifaceted collapse, natural forces, and external pressures. The decline of Comanche power in the late 19th century resulted from a complex interplay of ecological collapse, epidemic disease, technological change, and military pressure, illustrating how indigenous sovereignty depended on interrelated environmental and social factors that were systematically undermined by Euro-American expansion. The most devastating blow to Comanche power came through the destruction of the southern buffalo herds between 1868 and 1878. This ecological catastrophe resulted from multiple factors acting in concert. Commercial hide hunters, equipped with powerful new rifles, like the Sharps, 50 caliber, killed bison by the hundreds of thousands for their hides, leaving the meat to rot on the plains. Railroad expansion fragmented the bison's habitat, with the Transcontinental Railroad completed in 1869, effectively splitting the northern and southern herds. Military leaders, including General Philip Sheridan, explicitly promoted bison slaughter as a means to undermine indigenous resistance, famously stating that buffalo hunters have done more to settle the Indian question than the entire regular army. The statistics of this destruction are staggering. The Southern Plains bison population, estimated at over 8 million animals in 1850, was reduced to just a few hundred by 1878. In the single year of 1873, over 1.2 million buffalo hides were shipped east from the frontier town of Dodge City, Kansas. By 1875, when Quanah Parker led the last free Comanche band onto the reservation, their primary food source had been virtually eliminated. This ecological disaster was compounded by recurring epidemics that decimated Comanche populations. Throughout the 19th century, successive waves of smallpox, cholera, measles, and influenza swept through Comanche territory. By 1870, the total Comanche population had fallen to approximately 8,000 people, less than half their estimated numbers in 1780. Language and identity. The fight to preserve Comanche heritage. The Comanche language, Nmtequab, represents a crucial repository of cultural knowledge and identity, containing within its vocabulary, grammar, and speech patterns the accumulated wisdom and worldview of generations. As with many indigenous languages worldwide, Comanche faces severe challenges to its survival, though revitalization efforts offer hope for its preservation as a living heritage. Since the 1990s, significant revitalization efforts have emerged within the Comanche Nation. The Comanche Language and Cultural Preservation Committee, established in 1993, has developed teaching materials, audio recordings, and a standardized writing system. Educational initiatives have shown promising results. The Comanche Nation College, though small, offers language courses that combine traditional teaching methods with modern linguistic approaches. Several public schools in southwestern Oklahoma now include Comanche language instruction in their curriculum. The struggle to preserve Comanche language exemplifies broader Indigenous efforts to maintain cultural sovereignty in the 20th century. As one Comanche language teacher expressed it, "When we speak our language, we assert our right to remain Comanche people. Each word we recover is an act of healing from historical trauma." The Comanche story illuminates a chapter of American history that deserves deeper recognition. Their mastery of horses, military innovation, and diplomatic skill created a powerful nation that shaped the development of the American West. Today, over 17,000 Comanche tribal members continue this proud heritage. Subscribe to High 89 Studio to discover more untold stories of Indigenous brilliance.